The price of the ticket. How did I get interested in this book? This title, the cover indeed, is very, very provocative. If you notice, when Professor Balfour, if you haven't seen the cover, there is a photograph of Malcolm X at the top, who's looking squarely at the person who's looking back at the cover, and at the bottom is a photograph of President Barack Obama. In many ways, those two photographs serve as a metaphor for the book. Indeed, I'm going to talk more in a moment about what the meaning of the price of the ticket is. But there are two traditions of politics that are embedded on the cover of that book. But before I talk about that, I first want to talk about how I got interested in this topic. August 2008, the New York Times Magazine published this article by the writer Matt Bai with what I thought was a very provocative title, Is Obama the End of Black Politics? And the article gave this what I thought to be a very simplistic generational explanation for the rise of Barack Obama, that there is a changing of the guard in many ways. There was the old civil rights guard of people like John Lewis, who's a member of Congress from my hometown of Atlanta, or Julian Bond, who used to be a professor here, but back in those days when I was growing up in Atlanta, he was actually my state representative. And so there was the belief that there was a changing of the guard. This new generation, post-civil rights, post-civil rights generation, was less concerned about racially specific issues. They were technocrats. They were just interested in issues that affected all people, right? Not particularly, race was sort of something that they were interested as a byproduct in many ways. And again, I thought there was this overly simplistic explanation, and I thought for someone who had been writing on these issues for over 2 decades, that there was a great deal that was missing. Ideological contestation in the black community is one of those issues. And so I wanted to shift the debate to thinking about the rise of Barack Obama by putting his election within the context of black political struggles that really developed around electoral politics in the 1960s, right? Because here we go back to why the two figures on the cover. Around the mid-1960s, Malcolm X gave this famous speech, the Ballad of the Bullet, where he was really criticizing how black voters, those blacks who could vote at the time, were using their vote. He thought that politicians were exploiting the black community, and he didn't make a distinction between black and white politicians, I want to point out. He talked about how issues need to be community-driven, right? And that a litmus test for deciding whether African Americans should support candidates would be based on how they address those community issues. There was another thinker, activist around the same period, who was an ally, a lieutenant of Dr. King, and his name was Bayard Rustin. He wrote a very interesting essay in Commentary magazine around the same time of the Ballad and the Bullet called From Protest to Politics. And what he was doing is trying to steer the movement into, or African Americans in being a part of the Democratic Party coalition. And he thought very concretely about coalition politics. It was very important to build coalitions with liberal whites, in particular union activists, liberal religious institutions. And, he didn't say this concretely, but it was all around issues around universal policies, right? Something that would benefit everyone. Because as he predicted quite correctly, there were going to be economic change in the American economy. And so he thought that particularly issues addressing things like health care, other economic issues about the transformation of the economy would affect African Americans, but he thought that they should be part of this wider coalition. So in many ways, there's this tension, because starting in the 60s with Malcolm, and then there were other people who were talking about the community-centered approach. Stokely Carmichael and Charles V. Hamilton wrote a very interesting book called Black Power, The Politics of Liberation, where they also talked about in a very more specific way than Malcolm X about the need of community-centered approach to politics. And they were very cautious, I would say, of coalition politics, because they thought that the idea of coalitions may actually co-opt community interest. Right? So they were very skeptical. And so in many ways, we see this tension. We see starting in the 60s with Malcolm, and what has ended up with the triumph of this coalition approach to politics that we see with the election of Barack Obama. Now, there are some intervening factors in this. I'm not going to talk about specific because I'm going to read a portion of the book. But I want you to keep in mind that in addition to this universal approach to coalition building, there's also something that happened beginning in the 1980s when black elected officials who came from mostly predominantly black legislative districts, schools districts, were beginning to have an ambition to break the glass ceiling. Right? They wanted to run for public offices, higher public offices, mayor, governor, as in the state of Virginia. And in order to do that, they began to adopt what scholars of black politics have coined as deracialization. Deracialization is a campaign strategy. This is what minority candidates do. What they do is sort of de-emphasize race-specific policies like affirmative action or even issues around poverty, but they also emphasize the importance of racial unity. And what happens when you have the combination of this campaign strategy, because oftentimes what these ambitious black politicians, they usually have black voters as a base, right? And so they rely on black voters. But in many ways, the coalition, the need to build coalitions in combination with the focus on deracialization actually undermines the ability of African Americans to put race-specific issues on the political agenda, right? And so this is part of the price of the ticket, and I could talk about more about that later. So this is some of the arguments that are here. There are others too. There are some ideological changes that have occurred over this 30, 40-year period. I can talk more about. I'm not going to talk specifically about this now, like tensions within Afro-Christianity between black liberation theology, which is about transforming the individual and communities, and the gospel of prosperity, which is about transforming individuals, making them more materially prosperous and healthy and their families and that sort of stuff. Creflo Dollar, I'm sure there are many of them, black as well as white evangelicals. Another ideological manifestation, which is old as it's over 100 years old, the politics of respectability, which actually represents class tensions within the black community. This idea of the talented 10th, that educated African Americans, this is what Du Bois termed, are supposed to correct the behavior of what I describe as the untalented 9/10ths. I get credit for that term. I'm not sure Du Bois was thinking about this when he was writing The Souls of Black Folk, but it's the idea that the talented 10th are supposed to change the behavior of lower class blacks or working class blacks, and this goes back for over 100 years, in order to present a very positive face to white America of the race. But I would argue there's been a transformation of that over the years because of incorporation of African Americans into American life, particularly after the 1960s, because black elites are no longer just a part of the talented 10th of black America, they're a part of the talented 10th of America. And so when they use that rhetoric of respectability, uplift, as Obama did in the Father's Day speech, it affects public policy, which has consequences, right? Because it's much easier to say, you know, pull your pants up, do all these things, as a positive, you know, do all this stuff that you need to do to present yourself in a positive light if you pour. But I would argue that it really neglects the social and economic barriers that these communities face, right? And so these are the ideological tensions that exist, the politics of respectability, and the tensions between the prosperity gospel and liberation theology / the social gospel tradition. We can talk more about that later. But I want to read for you the parts of the book to give you a flavor of sort of where I'm coming from. In 1971, a British journalist noted during a televised interview of Muhammad Ali that the boxer was the second most prominent American after Richard Nixon. The journalist then asked the world's heavyweight champion whether he would like to be president. Ali answers with an emphatic no. Too dangerous, the boxer quipped. Ali's concern about being the president of the United States was not only because of the potential violence that might be directed against him for being a black man holding the most powerful position in the world. His resistance also was due to the extraordinary challenges that would likely confront him as the nation's first black president. Like in other words, Ali begins to inform the journalist, there's a ship. People are dancing on the ship, a lot of money is on the ship, a lot of food is on the ship, and I cannot integrate on the ship. I can't have equality on the ship, he says. I'm just in the galley working, and I could never get up and see the captain of the ship, Ali explains while rubbing his forehead. Now, all of a sudden, the man tells me, say, come on down, Ali, out of the galley. Hi, I want you to have something to drink. What do you want? Give me the number one spot from the galley to the number one spot, he continued. This ship must be sinking. Muhammad Ali surmised as a burst of laughter rose from the studio audience. Why is he so nice to me now? What moves him to call me up here? Black men have been mayors, now one might be president. America is in too much trouble. I don't want that job now. 1971. Now, Muhammad Ali's comedic reflection on the circumstances that would likely produce the nation's first black president is prophetic. With the election of Barack Obama as the 44th president of the United States, one could easily draw the conclusion that black America has reached the pinnacle of political empowerment, a journey that has taken blacks from being one of the most marginalized groups in American history, alongside Native Americans, I would argue, to being a key constituency that helps elect a man of African descent to lead the nation. But the economic conditions of the nation that greeted Obama after he was inaugurated and the race-neutral political rhetoric that helped put him into the White House puts the significance of Obama's election for black America in doubt. Far from black America gaining greater influence in American politics, I would argue Obama's ascendancy to the White House actually signals a decline of a politics aimed at challenging racial inequality head on. Now, scholars, journalists, and political analysts who have commented on race and politics in the wake of Obama's rise to the presidency view his success either as an illustration of Americans' progress in race relations, or view Obama like any other president who, whether Democrat or Republican, represents the interests of the rich and powerful. The only difference now, these critics would argue, is that the new head of state has a black face. Both supporters and critics of Obama have tried to deconstruct his lack of attention to racial issues and policies by speculating on the president's inner thoughts. Some have argued that Obama's biracial heritage accounts for his ambivalence on racial issue. Unfortunately, Cornel West has made this argument. I'm not sure why. Others believe that the president is reluctant to speak out on racial issues because he does not want to be branded as an angry black man. And still others think that the president is embracing a stealth strategy, quietly supporting black issues behind the scenes, out of the sight of right-wing detractors. It reminds me of explanations about Booker T. Washington, actually, during the late 19th century. Like reading tea leaves for clues, these commentators search the pages of Obama's autobiography to find rationalizations for one point or the other. Some commentators even try to decipher Obama's perceived uses of cultural cues, like the gestures he makes during speeches or his occasional use of black slang and dialect, to argue that Obama is sending signals to black voters to reassure them that he is one of them. Now, in this book, I go beyond what I would describe as this armchair psychologizing of Obama that too often passes for serious political analysis. Trying to dig into the inner thoughts of the president's view on race is best left to presidential historians who, as time passes, will have the benefit of primary sources and the distance of time to reflect on Obama's views. So this book instead does what political scientists, and particularly historically conscious political scientists, do best. It places Obama's race-neutral campaign strategy and approach to governing within the context of history, politics, and policy. So here I have the premise that just like any other president or candidate for the White House, President Obama makes strategic decisions about what issues to prioritize, what constituencies receive more or less attention, and what risks are to be taken when pushing forward a policy agenda. Now, my analysis takes discussions about Obama's presidency back to a fundamental question that still holds resonance for black politics today. What is the best strategy for black communities to pursue their political interests? Now, this question has been a central concern for black politics since the 70s, during this transition that I talked about a few minutes ago, sort of this tension between the coalition school and the independent black politics school. Now, I described that, but what I want to, so you know this tension between sort of the coalition school and the independent politics schools. So in many ways, I believe, given this knowledge, given this understanding, that a majority of black voters have struck a bargain with Obama. When it comes to speaking on race and poverty, unfortunately, President Obama has been unusually silent. As New York Times columnist, and you can ask him when he comes here, Charles Blow reported on January 28, 2011, President Obama had spoken less about the poor or poverty in State of the Union addresses than any president since Harry Truman. That's not a generation, that's about 2 generations. And the University of Pennsylvania political scientist Daniel Gillian has documented that the president has mentioned race in speeches and public documents in the first 2 years of his office less than any Democratic president, and on average, slightly less than all presidents, including Republicans, since 1961. Now, in exchange for the president's silence on community-focused interests, many black voters, I would argue, are content with a governing philosophy that helps all people, the coalition school, and a politics centered on preserving the symbol of a black president and a family in the White House. And so another theme of the book is this sort of classic tension in democratic theory, representative, the democracy of democratic perspectives, about the tensions between symbolic representation and substantive representation, right? Substantive representation around issues that represent the interests of people. Descriptive, symbolic representation, which is an extension of descriptive representation, people who look like you share your demographics, may not necessarily represent those substantive issues. So part of the price of the ticket, I would actually, is that there's a lot of assumptions going on that the symbolic and the substantive are actually the same thing when it comes to President Obama. Now, I want to say that the symbol of a black president is not a trivial matter. No one recognizes the power of Obama's symbolism, particularly for black youth, more than I do. It hit me a year into Obama's term when my then 2.5-year-old son asked his preschool teacher to pen the following letter. Dear Daddy, I miss Daddy. I want an ice cream, and Daddy said later. I want an ice cream, but Daddy said no. It's time to go to school. President Obama loves me. Now, it's hard to fight with the guy in the Oval Office or compete with the guy in the Oval Office. But this is what I'm coming against, even with, well, he's 5 now, but even my then 2.5-year-old kid. It is often difficult to tell what goes on in the minds of toddlers, but clearly Obama's image as a man of color in the White House has captured my son's imagination, as well as the pride of millions of African Americans, or of millions of blacks in the United States and beyond. But the grand bargain, granting black pride in exchange for silence on community-specific issues and the marginalization of targeted policies to address systematic inequality by the Obama administration, has left much to be desired. Now, the administration's silence on community-focused issues such as racism in the criminal justice system is evident in the most recent case of Trayvon Martin, a black teenager murdered by a neighborhood watch volunteer in Sanford, Florida. It is understandable why the president would not want to comment on the specifics of a case that is still being investigated. But it has been disappointing to see this president not voice concerns about an issue, race and the criminal justice system, that is of high priority to the most loyal constituency of the Democratic Party, a constituency that just happens to be black. Now, part of the problem is that black leaders and black voters are not pressuring the president on issues like reforming the criminal justice system because they believe that by raising these sorts of issues give ammunition to the president's political opponents. But as a constituency with specific issues that need to be addressed, remaining silent on these issues, as I've already said, gives the president no incentive to focus on community-specific issues. But this does not have to be the case. Placing pressure on a candidate, or in this case the president, does matter in getting issues placed on the national agenda. And when I talk about this, I often talk about how successful other key constituencies of the Democratic Party have been successful in pressuring the president. I think, for instance, the gay and lesbian community have pulled off a great campaign. In fact, the campaign is really reminiscent of the height of the civil rights struggle during the 1960s and into the 1970s. They had people pressuring on the inside, elites, people raising ruckus on the outside. In the case of electoral politics and the importance of raising money, many activists refused to hold fundraisers for the president. And it was a succession of issues. So at first there was some changing of regulations around federal benefits for partners. And then it moved on to don't ask, don't tell. And then the president came out to forcefully say that he was in support of marriage equality. And these things, it's not because, I'm sure in the president's heart of hearts, he believed that these were important, but these activists kept pushing him on these issues. The same thing around Latinos and immigration reform. You know, the DREAM Act was not successful. It was in a lame duck Congress during 2010. The president knew he didn't have the votes, but he put it out there because he was being pressured. And he continued to be pressured, and so we have through an executive order that said that, there would be a stop on deportation of young people. So there was sort of quasi-DREAM Act that was created through executive action. But it couldn't have taken place without any pressure from these activists who kept these issues on the president's agenda, even though he was reluctant to do it. And so unlike very key important issues affecting black communities, because what we keep hearing from the president is that, I can't, I have to be president of, what is it he always says? I have to be president of all of America, not black America, when black America is part of all of America, and there are specific issues that are particular to black communities, like, as I'm talking here, criminal justice reform. Now let me give you an illustration of why this is important, because I want to turn the clock back. Before Iowa, before everyone got giddy about, Barack Obama actually may be able to win, right? In 2007, when Barack Obama was competing fiercely with Senator Hillary Clinton, in fact, in most of the year, when you look at the polling, he was actually either behind with black voters with Hillary Clinton or very close. But I want to show you a remarkable thing about how pressure and how competition produces substantive policy discussions, right? So on September 28, 2007, candidate Obama gave a speech at Howard University's annual convocation. It was delivered 8 days after 15,000 to 20,000 blacks marched in support of Gina 6. I don't know if many of you remember Gina 6. This was a group of black male teenagers who were arrested and charged for attempted murder for a schoolyard brawl with a white classmate in Gina, Louisiana. Now, some black leaders at the time, including Al Sharpton, who's now a presidential advisor, criticized Obama for declining to attend the march. For one brief moment in the campaign, race and criminal justice had been placed on the forefront of the political agenda, and Obama, who rarely discussed racial issues, spoke to the incident. This is what he said. Thurgood Marshall did not argue Brown so that we would accept a country where too many African American men end up in prison because we'd rather spend more to jail 25-year-old men to educate 5-year-olds, the candidate told the audience. Now, he praised President Dwight Eisenhower's decision in 1957 to send federal troops to desegregate Central High in Little Rock, Arkansas. And so Obama told Howard University audience that there are moments when what's truly risky is not to act. He then expounded at length on community-specific issues, the tragedy of Junior 6, unfairness in the criminal justice system, opposition against affirmative action, and the racial bias of the Bush administration's Justice Departments. But not only did he raise these issues, he proposed policies. At Howard, at that speech, he said when he becomes president that he would create a federal-level racial profiling act. He also said that, he promised rather, that he would provide loan forgiveness to law students who graduated and became public defenders, because this was a way to even the playing field for people who couldn't afford attorneys. He also promised that he would encourage states to do away with the death penalty. He also promised, and this is part of a promise that did come through, I'll give credit where credit is due, that he would eliminate the disparities in crack and cocaine sentencing. And he noted at the time that the only difference in the majority of the users was the color of the skin of the people who use crack and cocaine, because there's a huge disparity, 100 to 1 at the time. Now it's down to 18 to 1. It wasn't eliminated, but it was brought down. And it wasn't also retroactive, meaning people who had been caught up in sentencing couldn't get released. They're still sitting in jail. But this is the point about the importance of pressure, making demands, setting an agenda. And so when there was competition, when people were asking where this candidate's voice was, he pretty much came through. So I could talk about specific things about the ideological points, but I want to conclude here with the price of the ticket, the meaning of the price of the ticket. The nation's concession to the election of Barack Obama as President of the United States, come with an implicit agreement that the forces that keep racial inequality intact will not be directly challenged. While some might argue that universal policies would ultimately dismantle racial inequality by casting a wide net across Black America, this one-dimensional approach to policymaking will not catch all the social ills facing Black communities. Targeted efforts will be needed. To paraphrase James Baldwin in his introductory essay for the book, The Price of the Ticket, the nation has, in one hand, surrendered to progress with the election of a Black man to the highest seat of power in the land. But in the other hand, the nation still obsessively clutches, and that's Baldwin's phrase, the resources and the goodwill needed to rightly attend to the long-term and persistent problem of racial inequality. For Black America and its leaders, the dispiriting silence to this reality is the price being paid for the election of the nation's first Black president. So there it is.